ready to go deep.
Yeah.
We're going to tackle the history of spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah, from ancient rituals all the way to what we're seeing today.
A huge topic.
It is. But luckily, we've got Nish Dubashia's A Brief History of God as our guide. And I was really struck by how he approaches it. Like, he doesn't just, list out all the different religions.
Right.
It's more like he's looking for the patterns.
Yeah.
How has human spirituality evolved?
It's a fascinating approach. Like, he's mapping out consciousness itself, the way we understand ourselves, the world around us, and even like the idea of something bigger.
Right. It changes over time, doesn't it?
It does. And what I find refreshing is that he doesn't like judge any stage as better or worse than another, just presents them as different ways of relating to these big questions.
I like that. So to kind of organize this massive topic, Dubashia breaks down spiritual development into these, stages. We start with tribal society.
Okay.
Then we move into the rise of power and individualism, kings and empires and all that. Then those more structured societies, very traditional beliefs. Then the whole shift toward rationality, science comes in. And finally, what we're seeing a lot of today, those more holistic practices.
So a huge sweep of history.
It is. But what I found fascinating is how he finds the connections across these stages. Shows how each one builds on the one before it. It's not just these isolated compartments.
It's a really elegant framework, and it all begins, as you said, with those early human societies. It's almost impossible to imagine, isn't it, a world where the spirit world isn't separate, but completely intertwined with your daily life.
Right. Like your ancestors are there, spirits are there, nature, it's all connected.
And it's not just a belief, it's an experience.
That must have shaped everything about how they lived.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about the suffering. They didn't see it as random or just bad luck.
Yeah.
No, for them, suffering was a sign of disfavor from the spirit world.
Huh. Do you think that created a constant sense of anxiety for them? Always trying to, please those unseen forces?
That's a great question. I mean, some level of anxiety, probably. But it makes you think, right? How is that so different from our anxieties today? We might not believe in spirits the same way.
Sure.
But we still grapple with the unknown, stuff we can't control. Maybe, on some level, the human experience has always been about trying to understand and influence those forces.
Yeah. Seeking a sense of security, whether it's through, like you said, rituals to appease spirits, or maybe therapy to manage our modern-day anxieties. It's like we're always trying to feel safe, in control.
I think you've hit on something there. Maybe the specific beliefs change, but those underlying human needs, those stay pretty constant.
So let's get back to those early humans. Dubashia talks about rituals and magic. Like, they were their tools.
Essential tools.
Not just symbolic things. They really believed they could, influence events.
Oh, absolutely. It was their technology for communicating with that spiritual realm. They could appease their ancestors, influence the weather, even try to heal the sick, all through ritual and magic. Imagine seeing the universe as this, web of interconnected forces. And you're an active participant. You can actually shape reality.
Yeah. Totally different than our worldview today.
Totally. And at the heart of all of this was their reverence for tradition and ancestral knowledge.
Makes sense.
It's how they kept that link to the spirit world. Ancestral knowledge held the keys, not just for surviving, but for navigating the spiritual realm, too.
Passed down through generations.
Exactly. And not just through stories, but through rituals, customs. Everything they did, their whole culture was like an embodiment of their spirituality.
It's beautiful, in a way.
It is. Now, this brings us to a really interesting idea that Dubashia calls tribal love. And it's not just about feelings, right? It's about loyalty to the group, shared responsibility, caring for the community. It's love in action.
Love is a way of life, almost.
Yeah. Imagine a world where the tribe's needs come before your own. Resources are shared. Everyone protects each other, raises children together.
It really does take a village.
Right. It's a very different expression of love than what we see a lot today.
Much more communal. It's about knowing you belong, that you're part of something bigger. And this communal thing extended to child rearing too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Children were seen as the future of the tribe. Everyone had a role in raising them, which actually makes you wonder, have we in the modern world completely lost touch with that maybe magical connection to the spirit world that those early humans might have had?
It's a good question. We see childhood as a time of, innocence and imagination.
Yeah.
Then we tell kids to grow up and become more rational.
Right.
Maybe in doing that, we lose something, a sense of wonder, interconnectedness.
It's something to ponder, for sure. So much to unpack there. But let's shift gears a bit. The next stage on Dubashia's map, the age of power and individualism. This is where things start to get really interesting. We see that shift away from that purely collective spirituality.
This is where those early civilizations come in.
Right.
A huge change in consciousness. Agriculture, cities, a focus on individual power.
Exactly. And if we look at, say, ancient Mesopotamia, we see how the development of agriculture in those city-states, it leads to social hierarchies. Kings, priests, a whole new structure compared to that tribal world.
And that new structure, it's mirrored in their spiritual beliefs, too.
Right.
It's not just about appeasing spirits anymore. It's about gaining divine favor for personal power, wealth, success.
It is. The gods, they become embodiments of power, and rituals become more transactional. You know, offerings, sacrifices, this idea that you can negotiate with the gods.
Spirituality becomes a tool for ambition.
You got it. And this focus on the individual, it shapes how they see themselves, too. Dubashia talks about the emergence of the ego and the idea of personal destiny. You know, you can shape your own fate.
Wow, that's a big shift.
It is. It's not just the will of the tribe or the gods anymore. You have agency.
And how did they interpret suffering in this age of power? Was it still like spiritual disfavor?
Not quite. Suffering became a test, a way to prove you're strong, worthy of respect.
Like those intense trials and rituals throughout history. The Spartan Nagoj, the Samurai Bushido Code. They didn't shy away from suffering.
They embraced it.
To demonstrate their inner strength. So different from us today. Always trying to avoid discomfort.
Right. And even their view of love was shaped by this. Love wasn't just about, you know, warmth and affection. It was about self-respect, honor, loyalty, defending your reputation.
A tougher kind of love. Almost like something you earn, not freely given. But even in this age of power and all that, Dubashia points to a shift towards social cohesion.
Yeah. What's fascinating is that even though they embraced ambition, they also recognized that you need cooperation, shared identity, laws emerged, ethical codes, even deities that represented justice and balance, not just raw power.
So they realized that a society just built on individual power, it wouldn't last.
Exactly. You need something more to create stability, ensure the well-being of everyone.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So this is the transition to the next stage in Dubashia's framework, the era of tradition and order.
Right, where we see even more structured societies and a big emphasis on cooperation, law, and a sense of transcendent order.
That's for next time?
But for now,
we've gone from a world where everything was filled with spirits to powerful civilizations shaped by ambition and a need for order.
An incredible journey already.
It is, and I can't wait to see where we go next. Back again. So last time, we were talking about how those early societies realized that ambition, just on its own, well, it wasn't enough. They needed that feeling of everyone being on the same page, a system for working together.
You need that balance. Personal drive, sure, but gotta have collective harmony too. And that's where this whole era of tradition and order fits in.
Right.
Dubashia uses those civilizations along the Euphrates and the Tigris, you know, Mesopotamia. It's like the prime example.
Those early cities, how they developed, it's amazing, isn't it? Social structures, governments, even written laws, like Hammurabi's Code.
Huge leap in organization.
It is. And religion, it seems like it played a huge role in all this. It wasn't just personal beliefs anymore.
No. Now it was about supporting the existing order, providing like a moral compass for the entire community.
Dubashia uses this term, transcendent order. And I gotta admit, it kind of throws me off. What's he getting at there?
Good question. It basically means they believed there was a divine plan to the universe, a cosmic order, and everything had to fit into it. Harmony with this order, that's what mattered.
So if you went against this order, bad things happened.
That was the belief. Individual well-being, the stability of society, it all depended on staying aligned with this cosmic order.
Huh. So their society, it was like a reflection of this larger order.
Right. And anything that messed with that harmony, whether someone did something wrong or there was like social upheaval, it was a big deal, a threat.
Okay, I'm with you. So this idea that suffering meant something was out of whack with this cosmic order, how did they try to get things back on track?
Well, that's where the idea of redemption comes in. Most of these societies, they offered a path back to alignment, whether it was repenting for what you did or making amends or strictly following a moral code.
Like a spiritual reset button.
Yeah, exactly. You could realign yourself with this cosmic order, restore that balance, both in your own life and for the community. Which actually reminds me of something else Dubashia talks about, that idea of the body and soul being separate.
Right. That seems like a big change in thinking.
Absolutely. This is where we start to see that clear distinction between the physical world and the spiritual one. The body, it's temporary. subject to temptation and, well, it decays. But the soul, that's eternal, your true essence.
Lots of spiritual traditions have this idea in some form. But how did it, play out in everyday life back then? Was it all about denying the body and just focusing on the soul?
Well, that's a common misunderstanding. They definitely emphasized the soul's importance, but it wasn't about totally rejecting the physical. It was more like recognizing they had different roles to play. The goal, to align the soul with that transcendent order.
So live your life according to those higher principles.
Yes, not about escaping the world, but living in it in a way that honors the soul.
And this idea must have shaped their whole view of death, right? And the afterlife.
Of course. Death wasn't the end, just a transition. The soul, released from that earthly shell, could then, depending on what they believed, ascend to a higher realm, maybe be reborn, or even face judgment.
It's so interesting how these beliefs echo even in our modern ideas about death. We might not have the same specific details, but that idea that there's something more beyond this life, it's still powerful.
It really is. And Dubashia, he doesn't just focus on the beliefs themselves. He looks at how knowledge was passed on during this era. Prophets, sacred texts, oral traditions, all shaping the spiritual landscape.
Those prophets, figures like Moses, Zoroaster, they were like revolutionaries, challenging the norms, bringing new ideas about the divine.
And their teachings, often recorded in these sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, they became the foundation for whole religions, guided people for generations. But these texts weren't just historical documents. They were believed to hold, eternal truths.
Like the source code for their entire worldview.
Right. A blueprint for life. How to govern, how to relate to the divine, interpreting those texts, debating their meaning, figuring out how to apply them to everyday life. That was central to their practice.
So not blind faith. It was about engaging with these ideas intellectually, spiritually.
Yes, it was active. Now, this era, the era of tradition and order, it laid the groundwork for so many religious systems we see today. But, every stage has got those little hints of what's coming next. Were there already signs that this stable worldview, maybe it was starting to crack?
Good point. Even within these structured societies, new ideas were popping up, weren't they?
They were. And those new ideas, well, they would eventually challenge the established order, lead to a totally new way of thinking about the world, the rise of rationality and modern thought.
Wow, that's a big shift.
It is, and it didn't happen overnight. But the rise of reason, science, that focus on what you could observe and test, it was like an earthquake. A whole new worldview was breaking through.
Okay, so we're back. And we've gone from, a world where spirits were everywhere to the rise of those really organized civilizations. But now things are about to change again, right?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. We're entering the period where reason, logic, it starts to take center stage. The dawn of rationality. It's a huge shift.
It's like a whole new operating system for the human mind.
Exactly. And it really shakes things up. Thinkers like Galileo, Newton, Darwin, they weren't just making scientific discoveries, they were changing how we understand knowledge itself. And it led to some pretty big questions about those traditional religious frameworks. Like, do those old stories still hold all the answers?
Yeah, it makes you think. For early humans, like a bad harvest, that was the gods being angry. But with science, it becomes a problem to solve. Better farming techniques, that sort of thing.
A much more practical approach. And it's really reflected in the rise of secular humanism. The idea that you can have a good life, a meaningful life, without relying on supernatural beliefs.
So human reason and compassion, they become the guiding principles. But was it a complete rejection of spirituality? I feel like there's got to be more to it.
You're right. It wasn't that black and white. Dubashia talks about romanticism and existentialism as kind of a response to this purely rational view. It wasn't about rejecting science, but more like pushing back against the idea that the universe is just this cold, mechanical thing.
So they were trying to hold on to that sense of mystery, the beauty, the stuff science couldn't explain.
Exactly. They celebrated nature, emotions, individual experience, the stuff that makes us human. You can't just reduce it to data points. It makes me think about, my own experience with nature. When I'm out hiking in the mountains, sometimes I get this feeling of awe. It's hard to describe, but it feels spiritual, even though I wouldn't call myself religious in the traditional sense.
It's funny how these ideas, they show up in our own lives. We're all trying to find a way to connect with something bigger, whether it's through nature, art, whatever.
I think you're right. We all have that longing. And this whole search for harmony, for a way to bring together the rational and the spiritual, it leads to some pretty interesting developments. Dubashia talks about how people started to see the universe not as a machine, but as this living, interconnected entity.
It's like that shift from seeing the world as parts to seeing it as a whole, as relationships.
Exactly. It makes me think about those images of Earth from space. That blue marble just hanging there.
It's incredible. You can't help but feel connected, like we're all in this together.
You really do. And it really changed how people viewed spirituality. There's this new focus on how sacred individual life is.
Yeah.
That each person's journey is unique and important.
And we start to see what Dubashia calls those alternative spiritual movements popping up.
Right.
So what exactly does that mean? Like, is he talking about cults?
No, not at all. It's more about people who are looking for new ways to connect with something bigger, but outside of those traditional religious structures, they might mix ancient wisdom with modern ideas, draw on different traditions, things like that. So you see the rise of, the New Age movement, that focus on personal growth. And then there's exploring those different states of consciousness, sometimes using psychedelics even, all to kind of, challenge how we see reality and find a deeper experience.
So it's like pick and choose your own spirituality.
You could say that. And it all leads to what Dubashia sees as kind of the culmination of all these trends, the rise of holistic spirituality.
Okay, let's break that down. What makes it different?
It's about the whole self, right? Not just your body or your mind, but everything together. So things like yoga, meditation, energy work, they all become tools for becoming more aware, finding that balance, feeling good on all levels.
And what about suffering? How does that fit in?
Well, suffering isn't seen as punishment or a sign you messed up. It's more like an imbalance, a disharmony within yourself. It's a chance to look at what's causing it and, try to get things back in sync.
It's not about ignoring the problem. It's about understanding it.
Exactly. Address the root cause, not just the symptom.
Makes sense. Okay, so how does this holistic spirituality thing change how we think about love?
Love becomes about connecting to that larger whole. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and feeling a sense of unity, of compassion that goes beyond just romantic love or even love for family.
It's like that saying, we are all one, but it's not just an idea anymore.
Right. It becomes something you feel, something you experience.
I can see how that would be powerful. Now, Dubashia also talks about this cognitive evolution of religion thing, which sounds pretty complicated.
Well, he's basically saying that how we understand religion, it changes as our minds develop. So early on, we might take religious teachings very literally. But as we mature, we can start to think about them in more complex ways, more abstract, more nuanced.
It's like you go from those children's books about God to actually, reading theology and philosophy.
Exactly. And Dubashia suggests that this evolution, it can lead to a more open view of religion, where you can see the value in different paths, appreciate how all these traditions are connected.
So instead of seeing different religions as being opposed to each other, you start to see what they share. That common human search for meaning.
Right. And it opens up the possibility of learning from each other, expanding our understanding of what's sacred. And that brings us to what might be the most exciting part of Dubashia's work, his vision for the future of spiritual evolution.
Okay, so what does he see happening? What's next for spirituality?
He imagines a future where technology, globalization, even just our own expanding consciousness, they all play a part. He sees us moving towards a more universal approach to spirituality, one that embraces diversity and recognizes that, we all share this deep need for meaning, for connection.
That sounds amazing, but also kind of, overwhelming. It feels like we're at this crossroads, like so much potential, but also some big challenges.
You're not wrong. It's not going to be easy. Dubashia is really clear about the ethical responsibilities that come with spiritual growth. It's not about just escaping from the world's problems. It's about using what we learn to make the world a better place, to make it more just, more compassionate.
So if someone's listening to this, what do you hope they take away from it? What's the big takeaway?
I hope they walk away with a sense of possibility and understanding that our spiritual journeys, they're ongoing. There's no one right answer, no finish line. It's all about growing, learning, finding ways to live what we learn.
It's about staying curious, asking questions, being open to new ideas, and remembering that we're all in this together, searching for meaning in a world that's constantly changing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And really, at the end of the day, that's what this whole deep dive into Dubashia's work has been about, exploring the fascinating history of spirituality, but also kindling that spark of curiosity, that sense of wonder in our listeners, maybe even inspiring them to start their own unique spiritual journeys.
I hope so. It's been a really amazing conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to explore your own spiritual path.